destructive deep dive podcast show. Let's dive in.
Okay, so there's been quite a bit of chatter recently about Senator Chris Van Hollen's trip down to El Salvador. It definitely caught my eye.
Mine too. It seemed to stir things up quite a bit.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we thought we'd really focus in on that trip, specifically what happened around April 16th, 2025. He went there primarily to discuss the case of Gilmar Abrego Garcia.
Right. And we're using an article from RedState as our main source material here. It gives a pretty specific viewpoint on the whole thing.
Yeah, it does. So our aim isn't to, take sides or anything, but just to pull out the key details from their perspective, give you the core information so you can understand what this source is actually saying happened.
Get straight to the point, basically.
Let's do it. So first off, Senator Van Hollen arrived in San Salvador and, well, he didn't waste any time making his intentions clear.
No, he tweeted almost immediately, didn't he? Mentioned meeting the U.S. Embassy team there?
He did. And he specifically said he hoped to meet with Salvadoran officials and, importantly, with Gilmar Abrego Garcia himself.
And he used some pretty strong language in that tweet, too.
He did, yeah. He called Garcia's situation an illegal abduction and flat out said he needs to come home. Very direct.
And according to the RedState piece, the reaction to that, especially on X, formerly Twitter, was pretty fast and quite critical.
What was the main thrust of the criticism they highlighted?
Well, the article points out that people online seem to question why he was focusing so intensely on Garcia, who the article describes as an illegal alien and alleged MS-13 gang member.
Okay, and there was other context mentioned, wasn't there? Something about a case back home in Maryland.
Yes, exactly. The article draws a sharp contrast. It mentions the timing this trip happened not long after a Salvadoran man was convicted for the murder of Rachel Morin,
Who was a Maryland resident, one of Van Hollen's constituents.
Right, so the criticism, as reported by RedState, was sort of, why this focus now on this individual, given what just happened back home?
That makes sense as a point of criticism reported in the article. And wasn't there also a more literal point made about his phrase, needs to come home?
Uh-huh. The article mentions people pointing out that Garcia, being a Salvadoran citizen detained in El Salvador, was technically already home. A bit pointed, perhaps?
Yeah, a bit. So, okay, that sets the stage for the reaction. What about the actual attempt to meet with Garcia? How did that go according to the reports?
Well, the article cites a report from journalist Ali Bradley. It states that Senator Van Hollen's request to the vice president of El Salvador, well, it was denied.
Denied outright. His request to visit Garcia at CCOT.
That's what the report says, yes. CCOT being that major detention facility there.
Was there a reason given for the denial?
The reason cited, at least according to the senator's reporting of the conversation, was procedural. Something about needing earlier provisions to arrange a visit like that.
Okay, so a bureaucratic hurdle, supposedly. But how did the RedState article interpret this denial?
Well, this is where their perspective comes through very clearly. They frame it as basically a predictable outcome. They called the trip a virtue signaling effort that failed.
Virtue signaling.
Yeah.
Okay. And they mentioned something about a photo op, too.
Yeah, they suggested it was essentially a failed attempt at getting a photo op.
Yeah.
The author even added a sort of sarcastic comment like, why didn't he just try calling Garcia from the U.S. if he really wanted to talk?
Suggesting the trip itself was more about appearances than substance, in their view.
That's definitely the implication. And they lean heavily on that procedural reason given by the vice president.
How so?
Well, the article interprets the vice president's comment about needing earlier provisions and potentially the American embassy making the request as a subtle way of saying the wrong person made the request.
So suggesting it wasn't the senator's place to ask directly, that it should have come through official, executive branch channels.
Precisely. The article pushes the idea that foreign policy is the domain of the executive branch, represented by the embassy, not individual senators going off on their own. They use the word rejected very deliberately to describe what happened to Van Hollen's request.
Rejected, okay. That leads into another point they made, didn't it? About potentially undermining U.S. policy.
Yes, building on that idea of acting outside proper channels. The RedState article claims that by doing this, Senator Van Hollen was, in their words, undermining the policy of the U.S.
That's a serious claim. Did they elaborate on that?
Well, they didn't stop there. They actually brought up the Logan Act.
Wow, okay. The Logan Act, just to remind everyone, that's the old U.S. law, rarely prosecuted, but it technically forbids private citizens from negotiating with foreign governments without authorization.
Right. So mentioning it in this context is definitely a way of framing the senator's actions as potentially improper, even illegal, though that's a huge stretch historically with the Logan Act. But they put it out there.
And wasn't there also some background mentioned about Van Hollen and the previous administration's view on Garcia?
Yes, the article adds that layer too. It states that Senator Van Hollen had previously accused the Trump administration of, quote, lying about Abrego Garcia.
So, suggesting there's maybe some pre-existing political conflict or disagreement over this specific case?
It certainly implies that. It adds a political dimension beyond just this single trip.
Okay, so the meeting was denied. What did Senator Van Hollen do or say after that, according to the article?
Well, he didn't back down publicly. The RedState piece highlights that he publicly called on El Salvador's president, asking him to basically let Abrego Garcia walk out of prison.
Walk out and return to the U.S.
Yes, and he apparently doubled down on his claim that Garcia had been abducted, so sticking to his original framing.
Interesting. Now, the article also touched on some other aspects, right, like the cost and maybe domestic perceptions.
It did. Towards the end, it raises the question of, taxpayer money. How much did this trip cost, especially given that the central meeting was denied?
A practical question.
And then it pivots to the broader political optics back home. It suggests a perception, at least from their viewpoint, that Democrats might be seen as prioritizing the case of this individual again, described by the article as an illegal alien alleged MS-13 gang member.
And they mentioned something else about his background.
Yeah, the article also notes that Garcia reportedly had domestic protective orders filed against him in the past, so adding another layer to the controversy surrounding him.
Okay, so let's try and summarize what we've unpacked from this red state perspective. Senator Van Hollen goes to El Salvador, says Garcia was illegally abducted, wants him brought home to the U.S.
Right. But his request to actually visit Garcia in detention is denied by the Salvadoran vice president, who reportedly cited procedural issues, perhaps hinting that the U.S. embassy should have made the request.
And the Red State article sees this whole thing as a failed virtue signaling attempt, maybe even undermining U.S. policy. And they even invoke the Logan Act.
Exactly. They also question the cost and the political messaging of focusing on this specific case, given Garcia's alleged background and other domestic concerns like the Rachel Morin case.
It really does highlight the sheer complexity when U.S. politicians get directly involved in legal matters in other sovereign countries. You've got different legal systems, diplomatic protocols.
Absolutely. It raises fundamental questions about where the line is between advocating for an individual, especially one with ties to the U.S., and respecting the legal processes and sovereignty of another nation.
Which leaves us with something to think about, I suppose. Based on what this source lays out, how do we weigh the value of individual diplomatic initiatives versus sticking strictly to established government-to-government channels?
And maybe how do different political viewpoints within the U.S. even see the goalposts here? What constitutes a success or failure in this kind of situation? It's definitely not simple. What does justice or due process even mean when you're looking across borders like this? Lots to chew on there.
You Democrats! Bloated bureaucrats! Like a New York sewer rat! Go away!